Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The stories shared here aren't just entertainment, they're reflections of real emotions, difficult choices, and moments that can change a person's life forever. If you enjoy powerful, heartfelt stories that stay with you long after they're over, you're in the right place. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt that something was different? Not because anything looked unusual, not because furniture had been moved or because someone had spoken, just because the atmosphere itself felt heavier somehow, as if the walls had witnessed something they weren't ready to reveal. I remember feeling exactly that way one evening. At the time, I couldn't explain it. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment everything began to change. My name is Sarah, and for a long time, my life looked perfectly normal from the outside. If you drove past our house, you'd probably think we were doing just fine. The lawn was always trimmed. The porch light came on every evening at exactly the same time. Family photographs decorated the hallway walls, capturing smiles from vacations, birthdays, and holidays. From the outside, we looked like a family that had everything under control. But appearances can be misleading. The truth was that our home had become a place where people lived beside one another rather than with one another. My husband, Daniel, and I had been married for 9 years. We weren't constantly arguing. We weren't throwing dishes or shouting across rooms. In some ways, that made things harder. When people think of a struggling marriage, they imagine dramatic fights. What they rarely imagine is silence. The kind of silence that slowly settles into a relationship over months and years. The kind that grows so gradually you hardly notice it until one day you realize you've forgotten what genuine connection feels like. Daniel was still polite. He thanked me for meals. He remembered birthdays. He asked practical questions about schedules, bills, and errands. But somewhere along the way, our conversations had become transactions. Necessary, efficient, empty. Most evenings he worked late. When he returned home, he looked exhausted. Dinner would pass quietly. We would exchange a few words. Then we'd prepare for bed. And every night, without fail, he would roll over toward the far side of the mattress. It wasn't a cruel gesture. That was what made it hurt so much. It was simply a habit that seemed to say more than words ever could. Then there was Mason, Daniel's son. 3 years earlier, Mason had lost his mother after a long illness. Grief changed him. Before her passing, he had been energetic, social, and full of plans for the future. Afterward, something inside him seemed to collapse. At 21, he carried himself like someone much older. Like someone carrying invisible weight every hour of every day. When he moved back into our house, I hoped it would help him heal. Instead, he seemed to retreat further into himself. He spent most of his time alone. He rarely joined family meals. He often disappeared into his room for hours. Some days, the only evidence that he was home came from hearing footsteps in the hallway. I worried about him constantly, but every attempt to reach him seemed to hit an invisible wall. "How was your day?" I'd ask. He would shrug. "Fine." "Anything interesting happen?" Another shrug. "Not really." The conversation would end there. At first, I assumed he simply needed time. Then weeks became months. Months became years. And still the distance remained. Daniel handled things differently. Or perhaps he avoided handling them altogether. He rarely asked questions. Rarely pushed. Rarely discussed grief. Part of me understood. Everyone mourns differently. Another part of me wondered whether both father and son were trapped in the same pain while pretending they weren't. Every morning followed nearly the same routine. I'd stand near the kitchen window holding a cup of coffee that usually grew cold before I finished it. Outside, life continued normally. Cars passed. Birds crossed the sky. Neighbors walked their dogs. Inside, the house remained quiet. Too quiet. Sometimes I found myself staring at old family photographs. I would study the smiles frozen inside those frames and wonder when everything had become so distant. Not broken. Just distant. There is a difference. Broken things announce themselves. Distance arrives quietly. One evening after dinner, I noticed Mason standing in front of the hallway mirror. At first, nothing seemed unusual. People look in mirrors all the time. But there was something about the way he stood there. He wasn't adjusting his hair. He wasn't fixing his clothes. He wasn't checking his appearance. He was simply staring, as though he were looking through his reflection rather than at it. I slowed my steps. For several seconds he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem aware of anything around him. And suddenly I wasn't seeing a young man. I was seeing someone lost. Someone searching for answers he couldn't find. Someone carrying pain he didn't know how to set down. The sight stayed with me long after I walked away. That night, while lying awake beside Daniel, I kept thinking about it. How many people move through life carrying invisible struggles? How many smile during the day while fighting battles no one else can see? How many sit in crowded rooms feeling completely alone? Those questions lingered. Days passed. Then small changes began to appear. Nothing dramatic. Just little moments. Mason started spending slightly more time downstairs. Occasionally he would pause in the kitchen doorway. Sometimes he'd comment on the weather. Sometimes he'd mention a class assignment. Other times he'd make an observation about something he'd seen online. The conversations were brief, often lasting less than a minute. But they were conversations. And after years of silence, that felt significant. I didn't push. I didn't demand deeper discussions. I simply listened. If he mentioned something, I responded. If he shared a thought, I acknowledged it. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, those moments became more frequent. For the first time in years, it felt as though he was allowing someone to see a small part of what was happening beneath the surface. I had no idea then how important those conversations would become, or how much they would eventually change all of us. One rainy evening, after another quiet dinner, I stood alone in the kitchen washing dishes. The sound of water filled the room. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. The house felt unusually still. Then I heard footsteps. Mason entered the kitchen. Instead of immediately leaving, he remained there. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Finally he looked toward the rain outside. "My mom used to love storms," he said quietly. I turned off the water. It was the first time he had mentioned her in months. Maybe longer. What was her favorite thing about them? I asked. He stared out the window. The sound. A faint smile appeared. She said rain made the world slow down. For a moment, the sadness in his eyes softened. And in that moment, I realized something important. Sometimes people don't need solutions. Sometimes they don't need advice. Sometimes they simply need someone willing to listen. That conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. But it opened a door. A small one. A fragile one. Yet a door nonetheless. And neither of us knew where it would eventually lead. The days that followed felt different. Not dramatically different. No life-changing conversations happened overnight. No emotional breakthroughs suddenly fixed years of grief and distance. But something had shifted. The silence that had once felt cold now seemed uncertain, as though the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. Mason still spent most of his time upstairs. Daniel still buried himself in work. And I still moved through the routines that had defined my life for years. Yet beneath those routines, I sensed movement. Tiny cracks appearing in places that had been sealed shut for far too long. One Saturday morning, I found Mason sitting alone at the kitchen table. That alone was unusual. Normally, he would have grabbed something quick and disappeared back to his room. Instead, he sat staring into a mug of coffee, lost in thought. For a moment, I considered leaving him alone. Then I remembered how many opportunities had passed because everyone in this family waited for someone else to speak first. I poured myself a cup and sat down across from him. Neither of us said anything immediately. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, sunlight spilled across the backyard. Finally, he spoke. "Do you ever feel guilty for being happy?" The question caught me off guard. I studied his face. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes remained fixed on the coffee. "Why do you ask?" I said gently. He sighed. "Sometimes I laugh at something." He paused. "Or I have a good day." Another pause. "And then I feel terrible afterward." I understood immediately. Not because I had lost a parent, but because grief follows strange rules. Rules that make no sense. Rules that convince people they're betraying someone they loved simply by continuing to live. My mother used to tell me that happiness and sadness can exist in the same room, I said. He finally looked up. What does that mean? It means missing someone doesn't mean you stop living. His expression softened slightly. It doesn't feel that way. I know, and I did know. Not exactly his pain, but enough of it. Enough to recognize the exhaustion in his voice. The burden he carried every day. We sat there for nearly half an hour. Talking. Really talking. Not about anything extraordinary. Just life. Memories. Questions. Thoughts he'd been carrying for years. When he finally stood to leave, he looked lighter somehow. Not healed. Not fixed. Just lighter. And sometimes that's enough for one day. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He seemed distracted. Restless. During dinner he barely touched his food. Afterward, while I cleaned the kitchen, he lingered nearby. Normally he would have disappeared into his office. Instead he remained standing there, as though he wanted to say something. Finally he did. Has Mason seemed different lately? I glanced up. The question surprised me. What do you mean? Daniel shrugged. I don't know. He rubbed the back of his neck. He talks a little more. I smiled faintly. That's a good thing. I guess. But he didn't sound convinced. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I don't know how to help him. The words landed heavily. Because they were honest. Painfully honest. For years Daniel had hidden behind schedules and responsibilities. Yet beneath all of that was a father who felt lost. A father who loved his son but had no idea how to reach him. You don't have to fix everything, I said quietly. His eyes met mine. You think that's what I've been trying to do? I hesitated. Maybe. He looked away. And for the first time in a very long time, I saw sadness instead of distance. I failed him. No. The answer came immediately. Stronger than I expected. You didn't. Daniel laughed bitterly. What does that mean? It means missing someone doesn't mean you stop living. His expression softened slightly. It doesn't feel that way. I know. And I did know. Not exactly his pain, but enough of it. Enough to recognize the exhaustion in his voice. The burden he carried every day. We sat there for nearly half an hour. Talking. Really talking. Not about anything extraordinary. Just life. Memories. Questions. Thoughts he'd been carrying for years. When he finally stood to leave, he looked lighter somehow. Not healed. Not fixed. Just lighter. And sometimes that's enough for one day. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He seemed distracted. Restless. During dinner he barely touched his food. Afterward, while I cleaned the kitchen, he lingered nearby. Normally he would have disappeared into his office. Instead he remained standing there, as though he wanted to say something. Finally he did. Has Mason seemed different lately? I glanced up. The question surprised me. What do you mean? Daniel shrugged. I don't know. He rubbed the back of his neck. He talks a little more. I smiled faintly. That's a good thing. I guess. But he didn't sound convinced. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I don't know how to help him. The words landed heavily. Because they were honest. Painfully honest. For years Daniel had hidden behind schedules and responsibilities. Yet beneath all of that was a father who felt lost. A father who loved his son but had no idea how to reach him. You don't have to fix everything, I said quietly. His eyes met